Thank you. So, did you love hearing from Celestin? Isn't it cool? I want you to know I visited his work in Uganda and in South Sudan, and it is every bit as fantastic as you can imagine. So make sure you learn more about alarm before you head out of here. Any rate, similarly, I was given the topic reproducible and transferable strategies. Unfortunately, I don't have his gifting as a theologian, so I spend a lot of time trying to scratch my head and work out what in the world am I going to say about this topic. So much so, I actually wrote back to Brian and said, "Can I have a new topic, please?" And he very, very sweetly said, "No." So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. So come Monday, I still hadn't worked out what in the world I was going to say. Yeah, one of those weeks. So I met up with my dear friend Heidi for lunch, and she said, "What are you going to be talking about?" And I said, "Well, I can almost say it, reproducible and transferable strategies. But I don't really know what I'm going to say." And she said, "Well, it makes sense to me. You did take a program from 0 to 10,000 churches." And I was like, you got a point there, girl. So I said, but the problem is I didn't have a strategy. Like, I never made a plan. I never meant for this to happen. If anything, I just tried to prevent it from happening with all that I could. Like, there's no strategy here. And Heidi, who's infinitely wiser than me, said, "Yeah, you had a strategy. You just listened to God and you did whatever he told you to do." And I said, well, there's some truth in that. She said, "That's very reproducible." I said, "You're infinitely clever." But I also thought in my brain, well, I could hardly get up in front of you and tell you the secret is to ask God what to do, obey him, and challenge others to do the same. Because you're going to be left sitting there going, "You are awful lucky girl that you have a cute accent." Because this is Sunday School 101. We know this already. But at any rate, I started to ponder it. I prayed about it. And God said, "Really? You're going to top this? You're going to get up there with your wisdom and have something better than ask God what to do, obey him, and challenge others to do the same?" And I realized, I was a little snookered here. It was going to be hard to top that. But I was also reminded last week, I went to Elizabeth, Colorado. And I'm sure you all know about Elizabeth, Colorado. It's got about 1,000 people who are all very proud of their town. You have to go down all these dirt roads. I didn't even know you had dirt roads in America, but lesson learned. Lost down a bunch of dirt roads I was. Anyway, I got to Elizabeth, Colorado, and I was visiting a friend, an old friend, and he's a pastor there. And he said, "Oh, we've been trying the Anna strategy." And I thought, oh dear Lord, what is the Anna strategy? He's never come to any of my training, so I was like, what is the Anna strategy? Share about that, that would be cool. And he said, you teach people to listen to God and do what he tells them to do. And because I'm a woman of great faith, I thought, praise the Lord, I can't wait to hear how this finished. Actually, I felt a little sick. I was like, oh dear, surely I didn't start this. So he said, well, at my church, we had a very rusty old broken down playground. And we felt like this was a safety hazard, but we wanted to serve our community with a playground. So we knocked down this old rusty old one, and we, a whole bunch of farming communities. So they got out, they plowed the land, they got ready for a new community, and they all gathered together. And the elders were kind of like, "Okay, what are we going to do next, Pastor?" And he said, "Well, we're going to follow the Anna strategy." And of course, they were all completely relieved because I'm a well-known household name. Yeah, they all looked like he had gone completely mad. So he said, what we're going to do is pray and ask God what to do. Ask God for a playground. And so, of course, I felt really confident when he told me this. I thought, praise the Lord, I can't wait to hear how this story ends. So I was like, did it work? He said to me, within 1 to 2 weeks, my husband and I can't remember how long it was, but he said within 1 to 2 weeks, we had not only a playground, we had the nicest playground in the entire county and all the counties that surround us. God gave us that playground. They asked God what to do, they obeyed. Apparently, it is a reproducible strategy. And we've seen it happen time and time again. In fact, one of the big thrusts of our work, we go in and, as I mentioned to you last year, we come in and we teach truth, and we're very passionate about teaching truth. But another big thing that we always teach is we need to be listening to God and finding out what to do. And I remember one pastor sharing with us that he had gone through the lesson, and we have one lesson about people are important to God, and we're talking about who are the people that are usually rejected in our communities. And so he had identified the gang leaders. He said, well, the gang leader is usually rejected in our society. And so he felt like God told him to go and knock on the door of the gang leader. And he was not excited about this. Probably like you guys. If God told you to go and knock on the door of the infamous gang leader in your community, would you be like, oh, Lord, what a great opportunity? Well, he was about the same. So eventually he mustered up the courage and he got to the door and he knocked on the door, and the gang leader turned up at the door, and the gang leader went completely pale. So the pastor said, I know, you're very, very drunk. I'm leaving now. Bye. And dashed off. Rather like I would have. Any rate, the next Sunday, the gang leader turns up at church. And the pastor's like, what are you doing here? And he said to him, when you turned up at my door, I wasn't drunk that morning. I hadn't been drinking at all yet. But you were glowing. You were glowing so strongly that I was overwhelmed by the light coming off you. And it caused me to go completely pale. And I am here because I want to follow that God that you represent. Walking in obedience to God. And so we started a program. As some of you know, we started accidentally. My great intention was to find 10 churches and go on a journey to find out what would happen if we just tried to change our mindsets. Would there be any impact? Would there be any change? And so we went on this journey. It didn't quite work out like I planned. I wanted 10 because then I could stay in control, and I like to be in control of things, and God doesn't like me to be in control of things, and we have this endless argument going on. But at any rate, we tried to start with 10. We ended up with 600 churches. Going on this journey to find out if we just teach truth, if we just break through this mindsets, if we just come alongside people and then challenge them to walk in obedience to God, doing whatever he challenges them, what will happen? And after 3.5 years, we started to see communities moving out of poverty. They would come to us and they would say, before we had no food for 3 months of the year. Now we have enough food for the whole year. Before we didn't have any schools in our communities. Now we have schools in our communities. We didn't have toilets and we didn't have wells. Now we have wells and toilets. Now we have stable housing for everyone. Now we have a good relationship with our community. Now we have a good relationship with the government. Now if we want to do something to show God's love to our community, we have to go to the community next door. We already have programs for the widows, programs for the orphans. Everything is already set up. And we have seen this program grow and grow and grow. Like I said, we're now working with over 10,000 churches. But the whole crux of the program comes back to God. What is God going to do as we walk in obedience to God? And there we've seen over 1,000 communities move out of poverty. And if you go and if you listen to the stories of those communities, you'll hear time and time and time again that they moved out of poverty because God turned up in these areas. As they did what they could, as they used the resources, as they put their staff down and it became God's staff, that God turned up in magnificent ways and lifted these communities out of poverty. Sometimes they had really cool stories. They, dug wells. And other times they had stories that made my stomach curl. I remember one time I was there and we had a training. The trainers all came in and one guy said to me, in my area we had a big problem. God told us to, all the buyers had colluded together and they'd driven down the price of the crop this year. So it was supposed to be around 700. Yes, it was supposed to be around 700. They had driven it down. It was maybe around 600. And so we weren't going to be able to live if we went with that new crop price. And so he said, but don't worry. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, don't worry. God told me to buy everyone's crops. And I said, well, what are you going to buy everyone's crops with? You don't have any money, you're a pastor. He said, oh, I didn't think about that. I said, oh dear. He said, but God told me to. And because I'm a woman of big faith, I wasn't at all concerned. I was a little stressed. I'm always like, what in the world? This whole obeying God is a tough one. But at any rate, I saw him again 3 months later. I said, what in the world happened? Did you buy everyone's crops? He said, yes, I did. As God told me, I bought everyone's crops. And I said, well, how did you pay for them? And they said, well, the buyers had no crops that year. And so the factory came to me and bought directly from me. And so the factory gave me 900 instead of 600. So you remember the price was 700. They had driven it down. The factories gave me 900 for the crops. And so as a result, we were able to distribute so much more to all it wasn't just his village. It was all the neighboring villages. It was this like inconceivable situation. But he said that was what God had told him to do. And again and again and again, it stretched my faith. In one area in Myanmar, they had wanted clinics. And so they dreamed and they planned that they wanted clinics, and God gave them clinics. In another area, their dreams got a little out of control. I like things controlled. Did I mention that? I like it controlled. Anyway, in another area, their dreams got out of control. So we had them draw a map. We asked them to pray and ask God, what should they put on the map? Well, these people apparently were wildly full of faith, more than a mustard seed these ones had. They drew a whole airport. Now, they're on the side of a steep mountain, so you can't be putting an airport there, to the best of my knowledge. You can guess what happened, right? 4 years later, the government came in and put in an airport in this random little village on the side of a mountain because they had dreamed that God had told them, you're going to get an airport. Because God can do amazing things. So I think as we ask the question, how do we have transferable and reproducible strategies? I think the answer is really simple. It's God. And it's as simple as that, and it's as difficult as that. So I have a few, we're not going there. We need to remember it's God's work. As I've shared, I spend a lot of time panicking about what's happening. Because I forget that actually this work is God's work, and He is far, far more concerned about what's happening than I am. When we started this program, I said to my dear friend who was doing the training, she went out and I told her to train 10 churches, so she trained 160. So I said, well, that wasn't good, but never mind. Can you find me some trainers so that we can make sure that the training keeps being, it's many modules, so we want someone from these different areas. So can you find me some trainers? So she said, no problem, I'll find you some trainers. Well, she came back, and what I didn't really understand, because I'm wildly naive, is that these people hadn't actually really been to school. Some of them have been to grade 2, some of them have been to grade 3, and they come in, they turn up, and these are my trainers. And I thought, oh my, what in the world is going to happen? Because we're a little protective about our materials, aren't we? Oh, you can't imagine how many times people say to me, how can you make sure it's happening exactly correctly? I'm pretty sure it wasn't. I have no idea. I think the best strategy is to remember it's God's work. God's got it under control. He's in there in the communities when the training's happening. We hear all sorts of stories back. Like I mentioned, we have this lesson. One of them's on love your neighbor. One woman came and she said, I heard the lesson on love your neighbor, and God reminded me that my husband's living with the woman next door. So I just went and started washing his clothes and all of that. I didn't quite see that as the application. Anyway, that was kind of God's twist on my my lesson. But, this man came back to his wife. He's now a leader in the church. And they are a family passionately after God. Because God can take our precious materials and bring forth the messages that He wants to be heard, can't He? What else? We need to make space for God. We talk about the fact that in our program there's this immense gap between what we're actually doing and what we hope to see happen. And if any of you have had to write proposals and fill in those log frames, it's a bit tricky when you have to put in the assumptions box. God's going to turn up and do miracles. If you want a beginner tip, right, God will fulfill his promises. It's a little harder for the Christian NGOs to turn that one down. But at any rate, are we making space for God? Or are we turning up as if we have all the answers? Are we telling people what they need to do? Or are we just bringing them some basic truths that they need to hear? God has given you so much in your community. Ask him how you can use it, because God is already at work in amazing ways around the world. Let us not turn up so complete in our strategies that we don't make space for God. Woo, we're out of time. We need to die to ourselves, and we need to finish the session. But it's a good reminder, isn't it? We need to be willing to surrender ourselves. We need to be willing to not always be able to collect all the answers. We need to not collect all the results. We need to be able to be willing to recognize that we aren't the hero. Because so often we want to be the hero in the story, don't we? And when we're the hero in the story, we don't let God have the space to do what he wants to do. We need to point people to God. We need to make sure that we're telling people, look to God for the answer. Now, I was incredibly fortunate. I started in a country where it was impossible to call me. It was there's a lot of persecution. Our program was illegal, and so people couldn't pick up the phone and say, Anna, we've got a problem. They had to call God instead. And we saw time and time and time again that God turned up with the most remarkable answers. And we don't have time for them, but they're cool. We need to pray and obey. We need to be people of prayer. We need to keep it simple. Provide appropriate tools and focus on the truth, because it's the truth that sets us free. So we obviously got through not much content really fast. I did want to mention as I finish up that we have some booklets at our table. If you would like to hear a little bit more, there's more stories in there, but there's actually some content as well around those stories. So if you would actually like a little bit more content, feel free to drop by our table and pick up some books. But I think we may have hell coming up now. But I just want to remind us as hell comes up that really, if we want a reproducible strategy, pointing people to God, challenging them to do whatever God tells them to do, is working around the world.